British living on this channel for educational purposes only and is not intended as financial advice. It is Setup Sunday time. Let's take a look at some charts. First, I wanted to break down what I'm going to talk about in the video today because it's probably going to sound like I'm turbo bearish when in reality, I've no interest in leveraged beta here. So what is leveraged beta? If you think of BTC as the benchmark, if you think of BTC as that which all others should be measured against, which it should, that's your alt BTC charts, that's your Bitcoin dominance. If you're not beating the benchmark, you shouldn't be trading. That's just the reality. But you buy and hold, right? That's how to continue performing with the benchmark is you just hold it and you do nothing. It saves you taxes, it saves you transaction fees, it saves you time, and the emotional management of trading, right? So that's most people. Now, most people don't realize or don't care that they're not beating the benchmark. Fine, whatever. I don't care, right? Doesn't matter to me. And then after that would be beta, which would be amplifications of the benchmark. Ideally, certainly not guaranteed. Correlation is not guaranteed. A lot of people asking, for instance, recently, why aren't miners working? Well, there's no guarantee that beta works out. That's part of the gamble. That's part of the allure. Sometimes it's 2x, sometimes it's not. Sometimes alts are dead for 35 years, and sometimes in a short weekend window, sand is up 60% or something silly, right? Like that's just part of the game. All the more reason to not just live in beta most of the time, unless you're super sure, right? If you have some idea you want to express, then fine. But again, if you're not beating the benchmark, what's the point? So it's good to measure alts against the benchmark. It's good to measure miners and coin and everything else, right? Then we can add options onto that. That's leverage on the benchmark BTC. We can add leveraged ETFs into the equation. And then, of course, MSTR, which would be above 2x at this point. So if I'm cautious here, I really don't want to live in beta land. I don't want to live in leveraged beta land either, because if I think a pullback is potentially coming, then you just got to be super careful. Or you don't care, right? If you want to eat the downside, that's fine. As long as you acknowledge the fact that, yeah, like this looks pretty overbought here. Maybe I shouldn't have a full portfolio of beta, of alts, of miners, whatever. And then on the leverage beta side, this is where a lot of people just kill themselves effectively. You know, this is suicide for a lot of people because you're adding leverage to your beta, you're adding leverage to your leverage, and most people just get wiped out. That's just the reality. So leverage margin, you know, buying stuff on a credit card, using margin through a broker, whatever. MSTU and MSTX, great example of people who will at some point in the cycle absolutely just get run over by the volatility there. ETU is deceptively leveraged beta because it's leveraged ETH, right? Leveraged coin, same thing. And then of course options on any of those is extra jet fuel on top of kerosene, on top of a tinderbox, right? It's just, so all that's fine. And there's a time and a place for it. I just don't think now is the time and a place for that. So for me, I tend to size this stuff down a little bit and I think of a notional value and that's my target. But if, for instance, I'm looking at this chart and on the BTC cloud, we are very far away from the Tenkan and the Kijun. Okay. Trend is obviously bullish. You know, I'm not bearish on the cycle. I don't think this is a top on none of that stuff, right? It's just, where do you want to be living right now? I can eat the benchmark. You know, I can eat the potentially 20% move down here. What I'm not willing to eat is a negative 40% or more move on leverage beta or just some random idiosyncratic nonsense with the miners, right? For me, it's just not worth it. But I do think you definitely have to be careful up here because we are screaming. We are screaming up here. So I don't like fresh anything up here at all. Now, this of course doesn't guarantee we pull back. It doesn't guarantee we go to 80. It doesn't guarantee we go to the blue line, the Tenkan. But when we are this far above both the Tenkan and the Kijun, that's a time to be careful. Now, we do have Sailor coming in, obviously doing whatever Sailor's doing, raising money, spending money, buying BTC, etc., etc. Great, awesome, cool. So either that goes through 100 eventually, or it doesn't. It goes to 100, 110, 115, and then maybe we get a pull back to 100, right? There's a lot of different scenarios here that could happen. But for me, it's just a little much to say, let's keep adding to the MSTR stack, or let's keep adding to leverage here. If you're not already positioned, if you're not already in a massively winning position, it just doesn't make sense to me to add up here. And I think that's what the market is also saying, because it's really struggling getting through 100 here because we've shot up so fast. I wouldn't say that's abnormal. It's just going to take some time. And it would make a little bit more sense if we consolidate a little bit. Realistically, we probably don't go lower than 90, probably don't go lower than 88. But this says be careful here. Caution, caution, caution. There is not a Williams fractal on the daily until 66. So that's not going to help you. I'll look at the 12 hour. Besides just eyeing the distance from the Kijun here, we can measure that and look at the last time we were this high above the Kijun. That's this graph down here, the blue fill. And we don't get much further than this historically. And it's done pretty well. It's kept up with price. It's just price has just shot straight up, right? Could it be different this time? Absolutely. Absolutely could be different. But this is a probability game. If you had to ask me, do I like a fresh trade up here? I already said no. Do I like fresh leverage up here? No. Do I like fresh MSTX options up here? No, right? Like, no, just no. I don't. It's not for me. It's just not for me. And we don't have to do anything. That's the thing here. We could just sit here between 90 and 100 for a couple of weeks and do nothing. But we are certainly overbought based on distance from the Kijun. We've hit the 1 hour super low time frame chart idea from last Sunday. This was an ascending triangle, perfectly reached the fib target there. Great, right? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? That's the question. But again, there's a volume bear div. There's an RSI bear div. If this pulls back at all, there is 100% evidence that it should pull back, right? Now, again, there's no guarantee. It doesn't need to pull back. It can do whatever it wants to do. We can get another higher high with lower RSI, right? This divs can just keep going forever. They don't need to play out like they did in March. So that's fine. They can cancel out. We can get a higher high in price. We can get a higher high in RSI. But for the week, I think betting on more up here is lower probability, certainly. This is the 12-hour Williams fractal at like 87. We probably get a Williams fractal at 96-ish soon. Here's the div again. On the 12-hour, if it's on the daily, you're going to see it on the 12-hour volume as well. So I would just be very careful, very cautious. There's two potential chart patterns to watch for that will probably play out by the time some of you end up watching this video tomorrow, because this is the hourly. We've got this potential for an inverted cup and handle with a target below 94. We've got this like tiny inverted head and shoulders target that may be enough to at least get us back to 100, another attempt at 100. There's also a yearly pivot at 100. We usually don't break those the first time we attempt to break them. But the longer we can stay up here, obviously, that's the best case. We just need to consolidate up here. No big deal. Another thing I had mentioned previously is this pitchfork. We're just as overbought now as we were in March. Now is obviously a different scenario than March was. I agree with you 100% on the fundamentals. You know, we've got Orange Man, we've got strategic Bitcoin reserve potential, right? You can rattle it all off. That's not what this is talking about. This is specifically looking at price and nothing else. Price and nothing else tells you, be careful. That's it. This can break to the top side, right? This can keep going. Nothing says this has to stop here. But taking fresh bets, to me, is a little much up here. This is, of course, the power law. This is the cycle view. The cycle view says, who cares? 20% drawdown? Love it. Who cares, right? This is what most people should be paying attention to. Nothing else, because they just cannot sit in a trade long enough to take advantage of the benchmark. That's what this is all about. So am I selling cold storage here? No, obviously not, right? Because we've got massive potential upside here. Before we go any further, I'm going to mention today's video sponsor, Kraken Pro. Kraken Pro is a complete overhaul of the Kraken trading experience with a one-stop shop for advanced and professional traders. Kraken Pro enables efficient trading execution across multiple markets with a UI that allows for unique optimization tailored to your trading style. You can check out Kraken Pro at the link in the description of this video. Non-investment advice. Crypto trading involves risk of loss. Cryptocurrency services are provided to U.S. and U.S. territory customers by Payer Ventures Inc., PBI, DBA, Kraken. Something else to keep in mind, you know, if you're good at TA, if you're good at trend metrics or whatever, and that's your core competency, and you're looking at all these MSTR options and you're looking at everybody rolling these up and thinking it's got to keep going, right? You know, you're straying from your core competency. So maybe just size that down, or, you know, be cautious with that. But that's how people get into trouble. They get super confident and we get a small pullback, and they're just over leveraged, and that's it, right? And it's very difficult to recover from that. On the alt front, the final laggards are starting to wake up a little bit. TIA was one such laggard. It broke above the cloud, I guess 2 days ago at this point. And Carpe Noctem, took a trade and it's still in a long on TIA here, just on spot. So I like a little upside on that one. I also like SEI. That's how you pronounce that one. This has similar criteria. This was kind of lagging everything else. Put in a little mini inverted head and shoulders. It also has the potential for some sort of other mega reversal pattern. It had some sort of channel falling wedge here, right? All these charts are basically the same. So if anything, the beta is all correlated. At least it was in the bear. And now it uncorrelated in the bull. Obviously, Doge broke out first. And the rotation games are playing out. So if I had to pick an alt today, it would be something that hasn't moved, potentially. I don't know how many of those are left. If we go down the list here, Sand was another one that was on the old watch list for the cloud. And this has a broadening wedge. You can see it immediately, right? This is a multi-year pattern. So, if you're all about Sand, what do you care? Like, you get a 20% pullback, you have some bids lower, right? You're hoping for that at this point if you're bullish on this. But this hasn't even broken out yet. This isn't above the weekly cloud. So if this is really going to run, you've got time on top of time, right? No reason to rush full port Sand and then expect this thing to go to 4 tomorrow, right? That's generally not how this works. But alts are certainly looking a lot better. As far as seasonality is concerned, Q4 is great, on pace with what we'd expect. We haven't seen December yet. November, one of the best Novembers on record. Typically, we see a positive December at the very least. So that means positive 0.1% at the very least for December is the expectation. That is the expectation. But so far, so good. On November, ETFs are popping off with the highest net inflow for BTC. And I don't mean ETH. ETH, sadly, is somehow still there, not getting flows. That'll change one day. I'll talk about ETH in a minute as far as the trading idea, but flows on ETH have been basically non-existent. Looking at funding for BTC alone, it is elevated. It's not as high as March. So that is one thing to acknowledge here, that despite me being super cautious and talking about the distance from the key June and the divergences and all this other stuff, funding is still reasonable. It's elevated, but it's reasonable. It's not crazy kooky land like March was. And across the board, funding is, for the most part, okay. If you take out, the high funding, just relative to the benchmark, relative to BTC, we aren't seeing what we saw in mid-November, which was high funding all over the place, right? That's another warning sign, obviously, is when things get too hot too fast, funding will spike. So funding still looks okay here. And maybe the longer we just chill out, we got plenty of time to keep going. Something else to obviously keep in mind is drawdown potential for the benchmark for BTC. That's 20 to 30 to 40%. I don't think we're going to see a 40% drawdown. I think a 15 to 20% drawdown is reasonable. I don't think you can sit here and just expect it to happen, but you can't sit here and be surprised when it does, right? That's just what we see on occasion from time to time. It's also interesting when you break out these cycles, just how tiny and small and insignificant, at least to me, that this cycle looks relative to the previous two. To me, this looks like November, October 2020. It looks like, I don't know, probably November 2016. It looks like we still have quite a bit in us for the cycle. All the more reason to not blow up on something when things look a little overbought. Comparing the cycle since cycle low, in the black there, we are in the wheelhouse of expectations. Again, nothing crazy here. Just funny how it all lines up. But we look good on that front. Performance since halving, we're finally catching up to 2016. And if we zoom in, again, we can sort of think of this like, all right, we're at 1.5 in 2021. We got to a 6 multiplier in 2017. We eventually got to a 30 multiplier. What's the bullish case, the bearish case, and then what if we split the difference? Again, all of this is pointing higher. Right? So yeah, right? We get a pullback, great. BTFD, that's what I'll be doing. But there's plenty of room to run in the cycle. MVRV also says the same, 3.29, no concern there. All systems go. ETF cost basis and MVRV is getting elevated. And again, we don't really know. We don't have anything to compare to as far as when will ETF longs be trimmed. Will they be trimmed on a quarterly basis, on a yearly basis? Will they be trimmed based on some risk metric in the portfolio? Let's say you start with 3% and it moves to 6 at the end of the year. Are we going to see just a bunch of harvesting on people who are up a bunch, right? That's something that's certainly possible, where people are just rebalancing their portfolio, not necessarily, selling that they're done and it's over for BTC. But that's something we have to see if that happens, right? And plan accordingly. But that might happen towards the end of the year. 2-year moving average multiplier, also no big deal. 216 is the top. 60 was the top when we hit basically 60 in 2021. We can zoom way out because the backtesting enjoyers are curious. This is a very good high hit rate signal historically. So again, we got plenty of time, plenty of room. Mayor multiple, also same thing, plenty of room. Nothing to be concerned with here. Currently the high on this is 157. Looking at the Carpe Nocta multiple, the 20-week moving average multiple looks fine, right? Now, let's say all these were elevated and we're at 150, 200, 250, 300. Yeah, I will be trimming and I will be selling. Absolutely, right? But we're nowhere near any of that yet. Value days destroyed, coin days destroyed times price. Again, we're fine. No issues. This doesn't look like March. It doesn't look like 2020, 2017. So this is not end of cycle stuff. This isn't pre-extended consolidation stuff. This isn't a ton of people selling all at once because they think this is an interim top based on on-chain metrics. Puel multiple also looks fine for the miners. No issues there. So collectively, if we're just doing this weekly saying, are we in or are we out? We're in. We're in, baby. Cold storage stays cold. No issues there. I'm talking about the trading stack when I'm talking about things being overbought and pulling back on leverage and on beta and that sort of thing. For ETH is still trying to tease a breakout at 3,400. I did buy ETH for the first time over the weekend, so we'll see what happens here. I'm not going to trim that ahead of any downturn here, but I am trimming other alt positions that I may have. The target for this would be, we'll call it 4,500. This hasn't really moved again, kind of like some of this other stuff has. So if you just think of ETH as another alt, then maybe it's ETH's turn here coming up, but it looks fine. Pull back 3K, 2,700, something like that. But the coming in possibility is definitely there. For Sol, I like 200 as a Kijun mean reversion play. That would make sense. That's basically the top of the range as well. And if this keeps going, 350 is reasonable. But this is also quite extended and hasn't really had many red days. It's done pretty well here. And if we go to like XRP and we zoom in, there's this possibility as well, which is we actually put in a real deal reversal pattern on some of this stuff. So I would definitely be watching anything that's been just straight up, just completely vertical. Bump that down to probably the 4-hour and see what you see. But I can't unsee the possibility of shoulder, head, shoulder maybe coming up into December or something like that. We do still have very strong tether demand, and we know that because the tether price on Kraken specifically, USDT, USD is above $1. So that does say that there's a lot of demand for tether, and when there's demand for tether, we see tether prints, and that's what we've seen. So that's what we expect to see. Tether has printed something like 15 billion in November alone, and most of that is probably going into the alt ecosystem just across the board. So that's a very good sign for continuation. One thing that isn't quite as bullish is how the DXY has just shot straight up. Now, in the face of this, we've actually done well. We've done very well, obviously. BTC up 50% or whatever it is in the same period. But it does represent a new multi-year high here for DXY. And if this keeps going, if there's anything that's going to stop BTC, if there's anything that's going to make BTC pay for those bear divs, it's going to be something like DXY just going out of control and going to 109, 110, whatever that is, right? Now, if this stays in the range, that's probably tolerable. And if this goes back to 1.02, then that means we're probably well above 100K at that point. But you certainly don't want this continuing to move higher. And if you're on leverage in beta in alts, right, you really do not want this to move higher because that will rain on your parade eventually. Trend-wise, S&P futures look fine. I don't really see a great trade setup or anything here. This is just sort of vanilla trend stuff. The same thing with NASDAQ futures, both gapped up today on probably the best Treasury Secretary appointment. No real trade here. Look fine. Really nothing to say, but definitely bullish. One interesting idea I saw was IWM divided by QQQ, so low caps over tech, basically. And it does look like they are trying to finally reverse, they being IWM relative to tech. It does feel as though the Mag 7 has slowed down pretty considerably outside of Tesla. It does feel as though potentially Mag 7 headed for a bunch of antitrust concerns, lawsuits, just slowing in general, AI spend very high. You know, we can go down the list and make stuff up, but the technicals are clear that this does favor IWM over NASDAQ. Another one I thought I'd revisit was WGMI over BITX, which is just leverage divided by leverage, basically beta divided by beta, however you want to think about that. And still favors BitX pretty handedly. Now you could argue the miners are oversold relative to BitX, the miners are oversold relative to MSTR. We're going to see some rotation. That's possible, but again, no guarantee. I like this much better back at 0.7 versus in whatever the black hole nothingness it is here, right? That's just me. But, you know, if you want to rotate early and you're looking for some value, maybe that's an option for you. And MSTR, man, it'd be one thing if I didn't take a trade on this and I'm telling you that this looks oversold or this looks overbought. I wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole, but I took a trade. I accumulated it down here. I let go of it at 205 and at 345, something like that. So for me, I don't have a trade idea. I don't have a setup here. I don't see anything else to do in the moment. Sailor absorbing an infinite amount of convertible debt is sort of outside of my wheelhouse of TA. So is it possible that MSTR goes to 1,000? Sure, right? But the TA says be careful for sure up here. The meat of the move for the moment certainly looks to be behind us. Now, yeah, you may get some craziness to whatever 650, I don't know, right? But I would just be very careful with this up here. Here's the zoomed out pitchfork in case you want the origin of the pitchfork. Now, this doesn't have to pull back to 270, okay? It just is a probability game where do you expect this to continue versus going sideways? That's it. That's all this is saying. Based on the previous rate of change since 2022, it says we are very overextended. Now, the MSTR people would argue the rate of change has picked up, and I'm not going to disagree with that. But for me, that's kind of a show me first, and then I can believe you. You know, maybe you can draw a pitchfork with a anchor point there, and there, and maybe you get something that's just literally straight up, but I would be very careful with that. The only other way I could think of measuring this was just zooming way out to 2020, basically when their treasury started. And, you know, this is just crazy bull targets for MSTR. This would be post a couple splits or whatever they do eventually down the line. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I would think it consolidates a little bit here at the midpoint before attempting to move higher. But it's definitely something to watch if you're super bulled up on MSTR. On low time frames, I like this idea of just waiting for the TK cross recross. You can see we've had, at least in September, a full cloud reset, and then we had TK crisscross there, TK crisscross there and there, there and there. And here we're probably going to get a 1 hour bear cross, which just says stay out, wait and see. And if you get a recross, that would be a re-entry. But up here, kind of like the gold chart, there's not really a trade for me up here based on the cloud. Here's MSTR BitX, again, just sort of measuring the beta or the leverage against itself. And this could end up being a head and shoulders. This could. You know, you could imagine a world where BTC pulls back and MSTR gets angrier, but that hasn't quite happened yet. But again, I don't see a great long trade or a great argument for MSTR over BitX here, just based on technicals. Charts I do like, Square. Everybody's talked about this, I think, for a couple of weeks now, but it continues to look good, continues to have plenty of upside potential. Obviously a Bitcoin adjacent company with a Bitcoin treasury. And I'm going to throw a little curveball in there as well with SCHW. I was looking at this last week, and it does have a multi-year inverted head and shoulders on the chart. I think if you're bullish financial services, exchanges, you should probably put this one on your watch list because the setup does look pretty good. So all in all for the week, it's all about the 100K level. Obviously, does Saylor breach the wall or not? And if not, do people sort of give up and start taking off leverage, start taking off spot positions until they see a better opportunity? Just because, again, we are screaming up here on the cloud. That's all I got for this one. Like, dislike, comment, share, subscribe, and happy trading.